I've seen a lot of things in my time on the bench. Thieves, liars, people who think a contract is a suggestion, and people who think personal responsibility is something that only applies to their neighbors. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, gets under my skin, quite like a person who takes money to care for the most vulnerable members of our society, and then fails to do the one thing they are paid for: keep them safe. We're talking about an infant. A child who can't tell you where it hurts. A child who can't run away. A child who is entirely dependent on the common sense of the adults in the room. And from what I'm looking at in this file, common sense was in very short supply at tiny Tot Haven. I looked at the plaintiffs, Maria and David Rivera. Maria was holding a stack of photographs, her eyes red-rimmed. David looked like he was vibrating with a mix of grief and fury. Across from them stood Mrs. Gable, a woman who looked like she'd spent the morning sucking on a lemon and was now prepared to tell me that the sky was purple. She was clutching a clipboard as if it were a holy relic that could protect her from the truth. "Bird!" I called out. Bird stepped forward, his face as impassive as ever. He's seen it all too. He handed me the medical reports. I didn't even look at the parties yet. I wanted the facts. I wanted the cold, hard science of what happened to an 8-month-old boy named Leo. I flipped to the radiologist's report. My blood started to simmer. Spiral fracture of the right femur. I read aloud, my voice echoing through the silent courtroom. I looked up and fixed my gaze on Mrs. Gable. "Do you know what that is, Mrs. Gable? Do you know what kind of force is required to break the largest, strongest bone in a human body, especially an infant's body, in a spiral pattern?" "It was an unfortunate accident, Your Honor," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was thin, reedy, and lacked even a hint of genuine remorse. "Children are active. They move. Things happen in a busy environment." "Active?" I snapped. I leaned over the bench. "He's 8 months old. He's not playing linebacker for the Giants. He doesn't even walk yet." "So don't tell me children are active. An 8-month-old child does not spontaneously break his own leg. Now, Bird, swear them in before I lose my temper." Once the oaths were taken, I turned to Maria. "Miss Rivera, tell me about that afternoon. What time did you drop Leo off, and what was the state of the daycare when you returned?" Maria took a shaky breath. "I dropped him off at 8 a.m., Judge Judy. He was perfectly fine, happy, eating well. I went to pick him up at 4:30 p.m. When I walked into the room, I didn't hear him playing. I heard him screaming. It wasn't a normal cry. It was a sound I'd never heard before. He was in his playpen, and Mrs. Gable was in the other room, in the kitchen, making a snack for the older kids." "In the other room?" I looked at Mrs. Gable. "You left an infant who was clearly in distress alone in a playpen while you were in another room. Is that your idea of supervision?" "I was only gone for a moment, Mrs. Gable said, adjusting her glasses. "I have a license for 12 children. I can't be in 2 places at once." 12 children? I looked at the file again. "Bird, what was the state inspection report from that week?" Bird handed me a second document. I scanned it. My eyebrows went up. "It says here, Mrs. Gable, that on the day of the incident, you had 17 children in that facility. 17. Your license is for 12. You were 5 children over your legal limit." "Why?" "People had emergencies," she said dismissively. "I was trying to be helpful." "Helpful?" I barked. "You weren't being helpful. You were being greedy. You took more kids than you could handle because you wanted the extra tuition. And because of that, an 8-month-old baby ended up in a cast from his waist to his toes. Don't tell me you were being helpful. You were running a warehouse, not a daycare." I turned back to Maria. "What did she tell you when you asked why the baby was screaming?" "She told me he'd had a rough nap," Maria said, her voice rising. "She said he probably just had some gas. But when I went to lift him, he shrieked. I looked at his leg, and it was already starting to swell. I asked her what happened, and she said, I don't know, maybe he got his leg caught in the slats of the playpen." I looked at Mrs. Gable. "Is that your story? He got his leg caught in the slats?" "It's a possibility," Mrs. Gable said. "Like I said, I didn't see it happen. I was tending to another child who had spilled some juice. Stop right there, I said, pointing a finger at her. You didn't see it? You are the owner. You are the lead teacher. A baby's femur is snapped. And your answer is, I didn't see it? That is not a defense, Mrs. Gable. That is a confession of negligence. If you aren't watching the infants, who is? I have an assistant, Mrs. Gable muttered. Where was the assistant? She was out on her lunch break. At 4:30 inches the afternoon, I asked, my skepticism dripping like acid. You have 17 children, an assistant on a lunch break at nearly dinner time, and a baby with a broken leg. This isn't a rough nap. This is a disaster. And let's get back to the leg caught in the slats nonsense. Bard, give me the pediatric orthopedic surgeon's statement. I read the statement into the record. The doctor was very clear. A spiral fracture in a non-ambulatory child is a major red flag for physical trauma. It's caused by a forceful twisting motion. It is not caused by getting a leg caught while rolling over in a playpen. Mrs. Gable, I said, my voice dangerously low. The doctor says someone twisted that baby's leg. Someone picked him up roughly, or someone stepped on him, or someone, perhaps one of the 17 children you were failing to supervise, grabbed that baby and twisted. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. What happened to Leo? I don't know, she insisted, though she was looking at the floor now. Then you are responsible for the maximum amount of damages this court can award, I said. You took the money, you took the responsibility, and you failed. But we aren't done. I want to know about the other child who spilled the juice. Who was that? It was a 4-year-old, Mrs. Gable said. And where was that 4-year-old in relation to the playpen? In the same room. I have an open plan layout. So you have 4-year-olds running around in the same space as an 8-month-old who was on the floor or in a low playpen? Do you have a fence? Do you have a barrier? No, we encourage intergenerational play, she said, using a buzzword that clearly made her feel sophisticated. Intergenerational play? I scoffed. A 4-year-old is not an older generation. A 4-year-old is a chaotic force of nature. You don't put a toddler in the same area as an infant without a physical barrier. That's Daycare 101. If a 4-year-old tripped and fell into that playpen or tried to pull the baby out, that leg would snap, and you weren't there to stop it because you were overwhelmed by the 17 kids you chose to take. I looked at David Rivera. He hadn't said a word, but his knuckles were white where he was gripping the podium. Mr. Rivera, I said, what did the hospital's social worker tell you? They had to report it to Child Protective Services, Judge David said, his voice thick with emotion. Because the injury was so inconsistent with the daycare's story for 48 hours, we were the suspects. They looked at us like we were monsters. They came to our house. They interviewed our neighbors, all because she couldn't or wouldn't tell the truth about what happened in that room. I turned my gaze back to Mrs. Gable. She didn't look bothered by the fact that she nearly cost these parents their children. She just looked annoyed that she had to be in court. You are a piece of work, Mrs. Gable, I said. A real piece of work. You're a piece of work, Mrs. Gable, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air like a heavy curtain. You sit there with your clipboard and your intergenerational nonsense while these parents were being investigated by the state because of your incompetence. Do you have children of your own? I have 3 grown sons, Your Honor, she said stiffly. Then you know that a baby doesn't scream like that unless something is fundamentally wrong. And yet, you didn't call 911. You didn't call the parents. You didn't even call a neighbor. You just sat him back in a playpen and waited for his mother to show up so you could tell her he had gas. That's not just negligence, Mrs. Gable, that's cruel. I turned to Bird. Give me the logbook from the daycare for that day. I want to see the sign-in sheets. Bard handed over a messy binder. I flipped through the pages. My eyes narrowed. Mrs. Gable, you have 17 names signed in for the morning session. 17. And yet, your assistant, a Miss Chloe Higgins, signed out at 1 p.m. Is that correct? She had a doctor's appointment, Mrs. Gable muttered. So from 1 p.m. until 4:30 p.m., when Maria arrived, you were alone? One woman with 17 children, ranging in age from 8 months to 5 years old. Is that the truth? I've done it before, she said, her chin lifting defiantly. I'm very experienced. I don't care if you've been doing it since the Mayflower landed, I shouted, slamming my hand on the bench. The law says 12. The law says 12 because one human being cannot safely supervise more than that, especially when infants are involved. You were running a fire hazard and a death trap, and you did it for one reason, money. 5 extra kids at, $200 a week? That's an extra $1,000 in your pocket while that baby's leg was being snapped like a dry twig. I looked at the photos Maria had provided. Leo was in a speaker cast, a massive, heavy plaster contraption that went from his chest down to his ankles, keeping his hips and legs totally immobilized. He looked tiny and miserable, like a little bird with broken wings. Miss Rivera, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. How long was he in this cast? 6 weeks, Judge Judy, Maria said, her voice trembling. 6 weeks where he couldn't crawl, couldn't sit up, couldn't even be bathed properly. I had to take a leave of absence from my job because no other daycare would take a child in a spica cast. It was a nightmare. He cried every time we had to change his diaper because moving him at all hurt. And the medical bills? Our insurance covered most, but we have a $5,000 deductible plus the lost wages, David Rivera added. We're suing for the full $5,000, which doesn't even begin to cover the trauma. I turned back to Mrs. Gable. You're countersuing for defamation and loss of business. You claim that because the Riveras posted about the incident on a local Facebook group, you lost half your clients. Is that your claim? They ruined my reputation, Mrs. Gable cried, her voice finally losing its flat tone and becoming shrill. I've been in that neighborhood for 15 years. Now I'm being harassed. People walked by and spit at my house. They told lies about me. Lies? I asked, leaning forward. Did the baby have a broken leg? Yes or no? Well, yes, but was the leg broken while he was in your care? Yes or no? I suppose so, but I didn't do it. Then it's not defamation, you foolish woman. It's the truth. I leaned back and sighed, looking at her with pure disdain. Defamation is when someone tells a lie that hurts your business. If I tell people you're a negligent daycare provider because a baby's femur snapped under your watch while you were over capacity, I'm not defaming you. I'm warning the public. You ruined your own reputation the moment you decided that 5 extra checks were worth more than Leo's safety. It was an accident, she screamed. Accidents are covered under my waiver. They signed a contract saying I'm not liable for accidental injuries. Bird, get me the contract, I said. I scanned the document she'd provided. It was a poorly photocopied sheet of paper with language that looked like it had been copied from a 1980s summer camp brochure. I found the clause. Paragraph 6. Owner is not responsible for minor bumps, bruises, or accidental injuries occurring during normal play. I looked up at her, my expression deadpan. A spiral fracture of the femur is not a minor bump, Mrs. Gable. And normal play for an 8-month-old doesn't involve enough torque to break a bone. Furthermore, you cannot contract away your liability for gross negligence. And having 17 kids alone is the very definition of gross negligence. Your contract isn't worth the paper it's printed on. It's toilet paper. In fact, it's less than toilet paper. Because at least toilet paper has a use. I have rights, Mrs. Gable insisted. You have the right to remain silent, which you should have exercised about 10 minutes ago, I snapped. Now let's talk about the snack you were making. 17 kids, that's 17 plates, 17 cups, 17 napkins. How long were you in that kitchen? Maybe 5 minutes, she said. Liar, I barked. I've raised children. I've had grandchildren. You don't prep snacks for 17 kids in 5 minutes. You were in there for at least 20. And during those 20 minutes, the intergenerational 4-year-olds were left alone with the infants. Isn't that what happened? One of the big kids tried to play with Leo or jumped into the playpen, or tried to pull him out by his leg? Isn't that the truth? I don't know, she whimpered. That's the problem. You don't know. You were supposed to be the adult. You were supposed to be the protector. Instead, you were a cafeteria lady in the other room while a tragedy was unfolding. I looked at David and Maria. Did the state revoke her license? They suspended it pending a full hearing, David said. But she's still fighting it. She's trying to reopen. Not if I have anything to say about it, I muttered. I looked at Mrs. Gable, who was now clutching her clipboard so hard her knuckles were white. You think you're the victim here? You're worried about your reputation? I'm worried about the next baby who gets dropped or stepped on because you're too busy counting your money to count the children in the room. I picked up my pen. I didn't need to hear anymore. The medical records told the story, the state report told the story, and Mrs. Gable's own arrogant, dismissive attitude told the rest. I'm ready to rule, I said, but I wasn't done with the lecture. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. Mrs. Gable, you are in the business of trust. Parents give you their most precious possession and trust that they will get them back in the same condition. You broke that trust. And then when you were caught, you lied. You tried to blame a baby for his own broken leg. You tried to blame a rough nap. You are a disgrace to your profession. I did my best, she yelled. Your best is a disaster, I yelled back. Now, shush, I'm speaking. I turned to the Riveras. I'm awarding you the full $5,000. It's the maximum I can give you in this venue. I know it doesn't pay for the 6 weeks of that cast, and it doesn't pay for the fear you felt when Leo was screaming, but it's the law's way of saying she was wrong and you were right. I looked at Mrs. Gable, and as for your countersuit for defamation, dismissed. With prejudice, if you don't want people saying you're a bad daycare provider, don't be a bad daycare provider. It's a very simple, logical equation. Even you should be able to solve it. I slammed the gavel. We are adjourned. I stood up, my robe snapping as I turned. I didn't even look back at her. I could hear her starting to argue with Bird, but I knew Bird would have her out the door in 30 seconds flat. I walked into my chambers. The image of that little boy in that massive cast burned into my mind. Some cases are about money. Some cases are about pride. This case was about a woman who forgot that she was holding a human life in her hands, and I hoped she never got the chance to hold another one. I wasn't finished with the assistant, Chloe Higgins. She had been sitting in the front row of the gallery, looking like she wanted to melt into the floorboards. Miss Higgins, get up here! I barked, fired. Swear her in. I want to hear from the person who was supposedly on lunch while a baby was being injured. Chloe Higgins was barely 20. She was wearing a hoodie and had a look of sheer terror on her face. As she took the stand, she kept glancing at Mrs. Gable, who was glaring at her with the intensity of a heat lamp. Now, Miss Higgins, I started leaning on my elbows. You signed out at 1 p.m. The records say you didn't sign back in until 4:45 p.m. That's a 3-hour and 45-minute lunch break. Either you were eating a 12-course meal at the Taj Mahal or something is very wrong with these books. Which is it? I wasn't on lunch, Judge, Chloe whispered. Speak up. I can't hear you, and if I can't hear you, I can't help you. I wasn't on lunch, she said, her voice cracking. Mrs. Gable told me to sign out because the state inspector was in the neighborhood. She knew we were over our limit. She told me to take 5 of the kids, the older ones, and go to the park across the street so the inspector wouldn't see how many we had in the house. I was at the park with 5 toddlers for 3 hours by myself. The courtroom went absolutely silent. I looked at Mrs. Gable. Her face had gone from sour lemon to a shade of gray that usually belongs to a tombstone. So I said, my voice vibrating with rage, not only were you running an illegal, overcrowded warehouse, but you were also actively defrauding the state. You sent a 20-year-old girl to a public park with 5 children she wasn't licensed to watch alone, just so you could hide your greed from the authorities. And while she was gone, you were left in that house with 12 other children by yourself? It's not like that, Mrs. Gable started, but I cut her off with a roar. It's exactly like that. You abandoned your post. You were so worried about losing your license that you created a situation where a baby's safety was the last thing on your mind. Chloe, while you were at the park, did you hear anything about Leo? When I came back at 4:30, Chloe said, tears streaming down her face now. The house was chaos. 2 kids were fighting in the hallway. The babies were all crying, and Mrs. Gable was in the kitchen screaming at someone on the phone. I went to check on Leo because his cry sounded different. He was pale, Judge. He was just lying there. I told Mrs. Gable something was wrong, and she told me to mind my business and go clean the playroom. I felt a cold, hard knot of fury in my stomach. This wasn't just a case of an accident. This was a cover-up. You told her to mind her business? I looked at Gable. A baby is pale, in shock, and screaming in pain. And your response is to tell your assistant to clean the playroom? What were you doing on the phone? Who were you talking to? I don't recall, Gable said, her voice barely audible. Bird, get her phone records. I want to see who she called between 3 and 4:30 p.m. Bird, who moves faster than people think, had already anticipated this. He handed me a printout provided by the plaintiffs during discovery. I scanned it. Well, look at this. You called your insurance agent at 3:15 p.m. You called a lawyer at 3:45 p.m. But you didn't call the mother. You didn't call a doctor. You were too busy trying to protect your assets to protect that child's life. I looked at the Riveras. Maria was sobbing into David's shoulder. David looked like he wanted to jump over the railing. This is the most egregious case of child endangerment I have seen in a civil courtroom in 10 years, I said, my voice low and steady. Mrs. Gable, you aren't just a bad businesswoman. You are a dangerous person. You manipulated a young girl into helping you hide your crimes, and you let a baby suffer for hours because you were afraid of an inspector. I was overwhelmed, Gable suddenly screamed, her meltdown finally reaching its peak. She slammed her clipboard onto the podium. You don't know what it's like. These parents, they drop their kids off early, they pick them up late, they complain about every little scratch. I was trying to keep my business alive. I've given my life to these children. You didn't give your life to them. You took their safety. I yelled back. You don't get to play the victim. Leo is the victim. He spent 6 weeks in a cast that covered half his body. He had to undergo physical therapy to learn how to crawl again because his muscles atrophied. And you're complaining about people picking up their kids late? Give me a break. If you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen, literally, because you were in that kitchen while a baby was being maimed. I looked at Chloe. Chloe, you're young. You made a mistake by following her orders, but you're doing the right thing now by telling the truth. Get off that stand before you get any of her logic on you. Chloe scurried away, and I turned my full attention back to the woman in the lemon-colored suit. Mrs. Gable, you're suing for defamation. You want money because your business is ruined. Let me tell you something. I'm going to make sure your business stays ruined. I am going to write a judgment that is so detailed and so damning that no parent in their right mind would ever let you watch a goldfish, let alone a child. You think a Facebook post hurts your reputation? Wait until you see what I do to it. I picked up the pediatric surgeon's report again. The doctor noted that the force required for a spiral fracture in a child who cannot walk is often the result of a twisting and pulling motion. Usually this happens when someone is frustrated. Someone is trying to change a diaper on a crying baby. The baby is kicking, and the adult loses their temper. They grab the leg and they twist. Is that what happened, Mrs. Gable? Did you lose your temper because you were alone with 17 kids and Leo wouldn't stop crying? No, I would never. Then how did it happen? If the toddlers didn't do it, and the slats didn't do it, and you were the only adult in the room who did it, the tooth fairy, the ghost of Christmas past? I don't know, she wailed. Exactly. And I don't know is the most expensive sentence you've ever said. I looked at the Rivera family. I am awarding you the $5,000. I wish I could give you more. But more importantly, I am ordering that a transcript of this proceeding be sent to the state licensing board and the district attorney's office. There is a criminal element here, the fraud, the endangerment, the failure to report. Civil court is just the beginning for you, Mrs. Gable. I saw the color drain from her face. She realized then that her meltdown hadn't saved her. It had buried her. Judgment for the plaintiff. I said, my voice firm. And for the record, Mrs. Gable, if you ever try to open a daycare again under a different name, I hope someone hands the parents a copy of today's file. We are adjourned. I didn't wait. I stood up and walked off. I could hear Gable screaming behind me, a high-pitched, desperate sound that was eventually cut off by the heavy doors of the courtroom. In my chambers, I sat down and looked at my hands. They were shaking just a little bit. It's the cases with the babies that do it. You can replace a car, you can repay a loan, but you can't give a child back the months of their infancy they spent in pain and fear. I took off my lace collar and threw it on the desk. Bird, I called out. Yes, Judge, he said, poking his head in. Make sure that transcript gets to the DA by the end of the day. Personally, consider it done, he said. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Justice was served, but it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like a long, hard day on the bench. I took a deep breath, composed myself, and got ready for the next case, because as long as there are people like Mrs. Gable in the world, I've got work to do. Before I let her walk out of that room, I wanted to address one more thing, the waiver of liability, that she kept waving around like a get-out-of-jail-free card. Mrs. Gable, come back to that podium, I commanded. She hesitated, but Bird's hand on her elbow made the decision for her. She shuffled back, looking smaller now, but the bitterness was still etched into her face. You have a clause in here that I find particularly offensive, I said, tapping the crumpled paper. You state that parents agree to indemnify the owner for any loss of income resulting from reports made to state agencies. Do you know what that means in plain English? You were trying to contractually gag these parents from reporting you even if their child died in your care. You were telling them, if you report me for breaking the law, you have to pay me for the business I lose. Do you realize how unconscionable that is? It's a standard business protection, she whispered. It's a criminal's protection, I shouted. It's a way to keep your victims silent. It's disgusting. And you have the audacity to stand here and sue for loss of business when your business was built on a foundation of lies and overcrowding. You didn't lose your business because of a Facebook post, Mrs. Gable. You lost your business because you were running a shell game with human lives. You were shuffling children in and out of the back door to avoid inspectors. And eventually, the music stopped. And when the music stopped, Leo was the one who paid the price. I looked at Maria Rivera. She was still clutching those photos of the speaker cast. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind of exhaustion that comes from 6 weeks of sleeping on a floor next to a baby who can't move. Miss Rivera, I said, did she ever offer you a refund for the month of tuition you'd already paid when the injury happened? No, Judge Judy, Maria said, wiping her eyes. She actually sent me an invoice for late pickup fees for the day we were at the hospital. She said that because we didn't pick up Leo's diaper bag until the next morning, we owed her an extra $50. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at Gable. I didn't even have words for a second. I just stared at her. Late pickup fees? For a baby who left your facility in an ambulance? Rules are rules, Gable muttered, though she wouldn't look me in the eye. Bird, get her out of here, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Get her out before I decide to hold her in contempt for being a subhuman entity. I've seen some cold people in this chair, but you're in a category all your own. You're a stone. A cold, hard stone. Gable didn't move. She just stood there, clutching that clipboard. I said, get out. I barked. Bird finally led her toward the back doors. As she walked away, she looked back at Maria and David and hissed something under her breath. David started to move toward her, but I held up a hand. Let her go, Mr. Rivera. She's going exactly where she belongs, into the dustbin of the daycare industry. She'll never touch another child's life again. I'll see to that. I turned my attention back to the Riveras. You're going to get your $5,000. It's coming from the production. But I want you to take that money and do something for Leo. Buy him a college bond. Buy him the best physical therapy that insurance won't cover. And most importantly, forgive yourselves. You didn't do this. You were good parents who trusted the wrong person. It happens to the best of us. Thank you, Judge Judy, David said, his voice cracking. I watched them leave. They walked out with their heads a little higher, a little more peace in their stride. They had their justice, even if it was just $5,000 and a public lashing of the woman who hurt their son. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the courtroom feeling heavy. Usually, after a case ends, there's a bit of chatter, a bit of movement. But today, the gallery was quiet. Everyone was still processing the horror of the intergenerational playpen and the hidden kids in the park. Bird, I said, not looking up. Yes, Judge? I want to see the licensing board's number on my desk when I get to my office. I have a few things to add to the transcript. Already have it ready, Judge, Bird said. He knows me. He knows I don't let a case like this just go into the archives. I looked at the next file. It was a dog bite case. Usually, I'd be annoyed I get so many of them. But after Leo and the Spica cast, a dog bite felt almost manageable. At least dogs don't pretend they're running a haven while they're breaking bones. At least dogs don't charge late pickup fees for the people they've injured. I stood up and smoothed my robe. I felt every one of my years today. I felt the weight of every lie I'd heard and every truth I'd had to pull out of people like teeth. But I also felt the satisfaction of knowing that Maria and David Rivera wouldn't be looking over their shoulders anymore. I walked off the bench, my heels clicking on the floor. I didn't look at the cameras. I didn't look at the audience. I just focused on the door to my chambers. Inside, the light was soft. I sat down at my desk and took a sip of my tea. It was cold. Everything felt a little cold today. I picked up the phone and dialed the licensing board. This is Judge Judith Shaindlin, I said when they picked up. I'm calling about a facility called Tiny Tot Haven. You might want to get a pen. I have a story to tell you, and it's not a bedtime story. I spent the next 20 minutes laying it all out. The 17 kids, the assistant sent to the park, the spiral fracture, the insurance fraud. By the time I hung up, I knew Mrs. Gable was finished. Not just suspended, finished. She'd never be allowed to supervise a game of tag again. I leaned back and looked out the window. The sun was setting over the city. Somewhere out there, Leo was at home, hopefully playing, hopefully healing. He wouldn't remember the cast. Not really. He wouldn't remember the pain of the femur snap, but his parents would. And maybe, just maybe, the world would be a little safer for the next baby because we stood up for the truth today. I picked up the next file. Not a penny, the defendant had claimed in the motorcycle case I'd heard earlier. It's a common refrain. People don't want to pay. They don't want to be responsible. They want to live in a world where their logic is the only law. But as long as I'm sitting on that bench, that's not the world they're going to live in. They're going to live in my world. And in my world, if you break it, you pay for it. If you hurt it, you answer for it. And if you lie to me about it, you're going to wish you hadn't. I closed the file and stood up. I had one more case before the day was done, one more lie to uncover, one more truth to tell. Bird, I called out. Ready when you are, Judge, he said, appearing at the door. Let's go. I've got a gavel that needs a workout. I walked back into that courtroom, the lace collar crisp against my neck, the fire still burning in my eyes. I was ready. I was always ready. Because the truth doesn't take a lunch break, and neither do I. I walked out into the hallway for a brief moment, but I could still hear the echo of Mrs. Gable's voice. She was talking to the producers, still trying to sell her hard-working business owner routine. I stood there for a second, straightening my robe, feeling that familiar itch in my palm that only a heavy gavel can scratch. I realized I hadn't quite finished with her. I hadn't fully dismantled the specific petty logic she used to justify those late fees and the lack of an incident report. I turned around and marched back onto that bench. Bird, bring them back. I'm not done. The parties filed back in. Mrs. Gable looked hopeful for a split second, probably thinking I'd changed my mind about the $5,000. She was wrong. Very, very wrong. Sit down, Mrs. Gable, I said, my voice like a serrated blade. I've been sitting here thinking about your invoice for the late fees. You charged $50 because the diaper bag was left overnight. Do you have that invoice with you? I have it in my records, she said, reaching for her clipboard. Bird, get it. I looked at the document. It was a formal letterhead, tiny Tot Haven, Professional Childcare Services. Under the description of charges section, it said, overnight storage of personal effects due to unscheduled pickup, $50. Unscheduled pickup? I leaned over the bench. An ambulance ride is not a vacation, Mrs. Gable. It is an emergency. You were the one who should have called that ambulance, but instead, you let the mother find the child in shock. And then you have the audacity to charge her for the storage of a diaper bag? A bag that contained the child's clothes and bottles? Things the child might have needed at the hospital? I have to maintain my storage space, Gable said, her voice regaining that irritatingly smug business tone. If everyone left their bags, I wouldn't have room for the current student supplies. It's a logical fee to ensure the flow of the facility. It's not logical. It's ghoulish, I shouted. And let's talk about the incident report. Every licensed daycare is required to file a report with the state and the parents within 24 hours of a serious injury. Did you file one? I didn't think it was serious at first, she said. He was pale. He was in shock. His leg was twice its normal size. How much more serious does it need to get for you? Does he need to stop breathing before you pick up a pen? I looked at the file. The state says you filed a report 4 days later after the hospital had already contacted them. And in that report, you stated, and I'm quoting you here, child appeared to have a pre-existing fragility. Is that what you wrote? I'd noticed he was a bit clumsy, Gable muttered. He doesn't walk, I screamed. How can an 8-month-old be clumsy enough to snap his own femur? You were trying to blame the baby's bones for your own negligence. You were trying to build a defense for a lawsuit before the kid was even out of the ER. You are a calculated, cold-hearted person who should be nowhere near children. I turned to Maria and David. Did she ever call you to ask how the surgery went? No, Judge, Maria said. The only communication we received after the day of the injury was that invoice for the late fees and a certified letter telling us that Leo was disenrolled from the program effective immediately. Disenrolled? I looked back at Gable. You fired the baby you injured? The relationship had become litigious, Gable said. I couldn't have them on the property while they were making accusations. It was a liability. You are the liability! I slammed the gavel down 3 times, the sound ringing through the room like a death knell for her career. You treat children like line items on a balance sheet. You treat parents like obstacles to your profit margin. Well, today, the balance sheet is 0. You're paying the $5,000, you're losing your license, and if there's any justice left in this world, you're going to be answering to a judge in criminal court who has the power to do a lot more than just take your money. I looked at Bird. Is there anything else? Just the medical records for the other child who was in the room, Judge Bird said. The 4-year-old. Apparently, he had some bruising on his arms as well. Mrs. Gable, I said, my voice dropping to a low growl. Was there another injury that day? A minor scuffle, Gable said. Like I said, intergenerational play can be... Stop! Get out! I stood up. I couldn't look at her anymore without feeling physically ill. You've turned a place that was supposed to be a ham into a gladiatorial arena for toddlers. You're done. Bird, clear the room. I watched them walk out. Gable was still clutching that clipboard, her head held high, in a deluded sense of professionalism. She really thought she was right. She really thought the logical thing was to charge $50 for a diaper bag while a baby's life was falling apart. Once the doors closed, I sat back down. I felt the silence of the room. It's always like this after the big ones, the ones that matter. You hear 1,000 cases about people who didn't pay back $100 for a cell phone. And then you get a case like Leo's, and it reminds you why you're here. It reminds you that the law isn't just about money, it's about a standard of behavior. It's about the fact that we owe each other something more than just logic. We owe each other a bit of humanity. I looked at Maria and David through the monitor as they did their post-court interview. They were holding each other. They weren't smiling. You don't smile after something like this, but they looked like they could breathe again. They had been seen. They had been heard. And the woman who hurt their son had been exposed for exactly what she was. I picked up Leo's photograph one last time. He was out of the cast now, Maria had told me. He was starting to pull himself up on furniture. He was a survivor. And as long as I'm sitting on this bench, I'm going to make sure the survivors have a voice. Bird, I said, my voice tired. Yes, Judge? I'm going to take 10 minutes. Get me a fresh tea and tell the next case to wait. I need a moment of silence to wash the gable out of my brain. You got it, Judge. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I could still see the spica cast in my mind's eye. I could still hear the unscheduled pickup excuse, but then I thought of Leo pulling himself up, moving forward, leaving the tiny Tot Haven behind him. I took a deep breath. The world is full of gables, but today, one of them lost, and that's why I do what I do. I opened the next file. It was a dispute over a wedding dress. Someone didn't like the lace. Someone didn't like the fit. I sighed. After a broken femur, a bad hemline felt like a vacation. Bird, I called out, my voice returning to its usual sharp cadence. Let's go! I've got a wedding to ruin. I stood up, adjusted my lace collar, the real one, the one that signifies the authority of the law, and walked back into the fray. Because the bench is where the truth lives, and the truth never gets tired.